Okay. Welcome to Dis and Dat Information. We time flies when one is having fun. So we're up to chapter 9 now in Dussel's text on Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63. And the text is called Towards an Unknown Marx, a commentary on the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. And this chapter is the fetishism. Yes, it's the fetishism of vulgar and apologetic economics. Subsections are surplus value in Malthus, the disintegration of the Ricardian school, critical reactions, the fetishism of revenue, a sort of conclusion of the theories of surplus value. Hopefully, we're going to, at some moment, get into a critique of neo-Ricardianism. We'll be there eventually. There are no diagrams today, so perhaps our task is either a little easier or worse. The Fetishism of Vulgar and Apologetic Economics, notebooks 13 to 15, pages 753 to 944. First, a quote at the top from Marx. Classical political economy occasionally contradicts itself in this analysis. It often attempts directly, leaving out the intermediate links to carry through the reduction and to prove that the various forms are derived from one and the same source. This is, however, a necessary consequence of its analytical method with which criticism and understanding must begin. Classical economy is not interested in elaborating how the various forms come into being, but seeks to reduce them to their unity by means of analysis because it starts from them as given premises. But analysis is a necessary prerequisite of genetic presentation and of the understanding of the real formative process in its different phases. Finally, a deficiency of classical political economy is the fact that it does not conceive the basic form of capital, the Grundform of capital, i.e., production designed to appropriate other people's labor, as a historical form, but as a natural form of social production. So that's the essential division, is it not, right? From a historical materialist analysis. Anyway, close quote. These notebooks, the last of the theories of surplus value, but do not exhaust it because further ahead, yet other matters and authors are treated. Footnote 1 include also the beginning of subsequent matters. They are like an intermezzo. And for that, the final reflections about income, that is section 9.5 of this chapter, enable us to make a kind of conclusion of this second part, which goes from chapters 4 to 9. Now, once again, we've wanted to respect the order of Marx's notebooks and not to treat here the subsequent considerations of Hodgkin, Ramsey, Cherbulier, and Jones, because, as we will see, there are later discoveries that should not be anticipated. The reflections about fetishism perfectly conclude Marx's study of surplus value, subsection 9.1, surplus value in Malthus. We know well that, come on, we know well that Marx did not feel any sympathy for Malthus, footnote 2, but he acknowledges that Malthus has at least some merit. He has discovered the fundamental limitation of Ricardo's theory of surplus value. In his Political Economy Principles, Malthus wrote, quote, "It is clear then that profits must be regulated upon a principle essentially different from that stated by Mr. Ricardo, and that instead of being determined by the varying value of a certain quantity of labor employed compared with the given value of the commodity produced, they will be determined by the varying value of a commodity produced in comparison with the given value of a certain quantity of labor employed." Malthus. Close quote. About which Marx comments, quote, The real contribution made by Malthus in his three books is that he places the main emphasis on the unequal exchange between capital and wage labor, whereas Ricardo does not actually explain how the exchange of commodities according to the law of value, according to labor time embodied in the commodities, gives rise to the unequal exchange between capital and living labor. This excess constitutes the surplus value. Its size determines the rate of valorization. The size of surplus value determines the rate of valorization, close quote. However, Malthus confuses the value of money or the commodity as capital with the value of the commodity as such. That is, although he notices that the price of the commodity is greater than the cost, that is, there is a surplus beyond the paid labor, he attributes this surplus to the higher prices that the buyer pays. Now, what happens, according to Malthus, is that the buyer pays with labor, being the fruit of his own work, or rent, or some other income. The surplus labor that the commodity contains is not realized in the production process, but in the moment of the sale. The surplus labor that the commodity contains is not realized in the production process, but in the moment of the sale. So you already have this sense of movement, right? The one who buys delivers more materialized labor in money than the labor objectified in the commodity, that is the commodity's value. Quote, consequently, he falls back in his exposition, as we shall see, on the fatuous conceptions of the monetary system, on profit upon expropriation. It gets completely entangled in the most hopeless confusion. Thus, Malthus, instead of advancing beyond Ricardo, seeks to drag political economy back to where it was before Ricardo, even to where it was before Adam Smith and the physiocrats, close quote. Now, for Ricardo, the expense of capital is less than the value of the product, which equals P, expenses equal E. E, therefore, is less than P. But for Marx, the value of the commodities or of a commodity and money are equal. That is, E is less than P, which is equal to C, which is equal to M. For Malthus, on the other hand, the costs and the product have the same value. However, the commodity has more value because it includes profit, which is paid with greater accumulated or materialized labor. E equals P, which is less than C, which equals M. Again, Marx has to raise the objection as against the mercantilists because the commodity is sold for more than its value and the buyer is the one that pays the profit. Then the buyer would be robbed. According to this, the only buyer who would pay more than the value of the product would be, once again, the working class as totality. In fact, there are three possible kinds of buyers. A capitalist who buys capital from another, this can be applied obviously to finance capital, right? If one person sells unpaid labor, the other person buys with unpaid labor. Both realize that, it's realization, right? Realize unpaid labor, one as seller, the other as buyer, close quote. The second possibility is the independent producer. Also in this case, as in the previous one, if he pays more when buying, then he recovers the loss when selling. Now, if we were talking about artwork, this is the art dealer, right? Only in the third case, because the worker is never the seller of a product, but only of his living labor does he appear to be the only real loser in the buying, according to Malthus, or in the productive process, according to Marx. Quote, thus, the worker is the only one who pays for all the commodities above their value, even when he buys them at their value, because he pays money, the universal equivalent, above its value for labor, close quote. Of which Marx comments, criticizing Malthus from his own categorical perspective. His profit, that is the profit of the capitalist, as far as the worker is concerned, arises not from his having sold the worker the commodity above its value, but from his having previously bought it from the worker, as a matter of fact, in the production process below its value, close quote. So only in the case of considering the classes as totalities. In other words, this is a macro deal, right? It is understood that the exchange between them is always unequal. It's just a scale thing. But an important scale thing, because there is a scale difference between an inequality, as it were, between the feudal or the uneven developments between the feudal and the capital and the capitalist modes of production. That is, the totality of the living labor of the working classes subsumed by capital. The totality of the living labor of the working classes subsumed by capital is higher in its value produced than the totality of the money received as wages. There's always this discrepancy, right? Wages have this fixity built into it. It's not constantly being readjusted in that sense. As a result, on one hand, the totality of the money of the working class cannot buy the totality of its own product. And on the other hand, the surplus that is possible to buy, you can't buy that surplus because of its insufficient money, or because the surplus production is not paid for in the wage, cannot be appropriated as profit by the totality of the capitalist class. The capitalist class factions, that is, the productive industrial capitalists and other unproductive rentiers, right? Other unproductive rentiers might exchange between them without a loss, quote, so that each loses as a buyer what he gained as a seller. Now, the only exception is the working class, the Arbeiter class. For since the price of the product increased beyond its cost, you can only buy back a part of that product, and thus another part of the product, or the price of another part of the product, constitutes profit for the capitalist. Close quote. The capitalist class sells the rest, which is impossible for the workers to buy, to buyers who are not sellers. Right? This is how the ruling class operates. Hence the necessity of landlords, pensioners, sinecurists, and priests. Sinecurists, that's the PMC, isn't it, though? Anyway, back to the text. In this way, Malthus produces an apology in favor of unproductive labor, of the idlers who, in their laziness, allow the surplus production to be realized as profit. But in fact, this is absurd because the money received by the unproductive class from the productive classes is not new value, but already created value. So where does it come from? Malthus doesn't know. Marx insists it comes only from the living productive labor of the worker. Therefore, Malthus, in a confused way, though on the basis of a correct surname, the Anhung, falls, however, into nonsensical, vulgarized conceptions. That is, quote, in other words, it means nothing more than that cost price and value are identical, the confusion which, in the case of Adam Smith, and still more in the case of Ricardo, contradicts their real analysis, but which Malthus elevates into law. Close quote. Now, what was for Ricardo a contradiction to the law of value, for the mercantilist position of Malthus could be elevated to a law. The inequality between the value of costs paid by capital and the price of the commodity, which includes profit. Footnote 3. All the rest of the Marxist critique is captured. Damn it. All the rest of the Marxist critique is captured in the following formulation, quote, the working class, which according to the population principle is always redundant in relation to the means of subsistence available to it, overpopulation arising from underproduction, close quote. Now, underproduction means here not solvent needs. That is, the working class as a totality has more needs than money, or less viable products than needs. On the contrary, quote, the capitalist class is driven into production by the urge for accumulation. That's why they do it. The only way to avoid overproduction, which exists alongside overpopulation in relation to production, non-producers, and idlers, the disproportion arising from overproduction by the capitalist by means of overconsumption by those who enjoy wealth. That explains the positive appreciation that Keynes felt for Malthus. The solution to the crisis of 1929 was full employment, more spending, the creation of a market of confident buyers. Subsection 9.2, the disintegration of the Ricardian school. Two methodological reflections are necessary before beginning the subject matter of this section. Now, first of all, here lies some of the deepest discussions in all of Marx's work about the question of the fetishism, which he articulates regarding the concepts of absolute and substance. Footnote 5. In fact, many times one talks about the fetishism of the commodity or money or capital, but no one warns that all fetishism ontologically follows from the fetishization or autonomization of value itself. So we're talking about greater abstraction here. On the one hand, back to the text, quote, Marx, the wiseacre, footnote 6, transforms value into something absolute, a property of things, instead of seeing it in it only something relative, the relation of things to social labor based on private exchange, a relation in which things are defined not as independent entities, but as mere expressions of social production, close quote. Footnote 8. The following must be added in order to understand Marx's discourse. Quote, the development of capital already presupposes the full development of the exchange value of commodities and consequently their independent existence as money. The point of departure in the process of the production and circulation of capital is the production and circulation of capital. Is the production and circulation of capital is the independent form of value which maintains itself and increases. It is not only an independent expression of value as in money, but dynamic value, prosensuren value which maintains itself in a process in which use values pass through the most varied forms. Thus, in capital, the independent existence of value is raised to a higher power than in money. This is a kind of divergence, as it were. And, close quote, and before talking about the text commentary, yet a third quote, quote, Marx, the social character of labor manifests itself in a perverted form as the property of things, that a social relation appears as a relation between things, between products, values in use, commodities. This appearance is accepted as something real by our fetish worshiper. And he actually believes that the exchange value of things is determined by their properties as things, close quote. Now, how deeply, quote, how deeply our wiseacre has sunk into fetishism and how he transforms what is relative into something positive, close quote. Now, we're now in the presence of a central thought of Marx. Value is relative in all its aspects, A, because living labor is its creative source, B, because exchange is its destination, and C, because its own character is objectified social labor, materialized. Value can never be absolved, absolute from relativity. Its essence is a social relationship. To absolutize is the first moment of capital fetishization as such in its most fundamental nature. Now, a second question is analyzed by Marx. He frequently uses the denomination of production cost and cost price. See pages 269 to 73, and with the later content of price of production. Now, this quote, this is the cost price. And when one speaks of production costs in the proper sense, that is in the economic capitalist sense, then the term denotes the value of the advances, plus the value of the average profits. So you can already see a kind of movement thing going on here, right? Close quote. As we can see, Marx has not yet decided on the definitive name for the concept. See, it's still, he's still working through this. The genetic constitution, see sections 9.4 and 12.4 of the category, has not yet concluded. This is the importance of why we go. Let me break here for a second. This is the importance of why we have this question of categories. And this goes back to issues going back, to Kant, Hegel, etc., as we've looked at in the book on subsumption. Back to the text. Returning to the subject matter of this section, Marx confronts first Torrance's theory, but from a general theoretical framework regarding all the Ricardian school. Quote, all the exposition about the Ricardian school brings up the dissolution of the school in 2 points. That is, number one, exchange between capital and labor according to the law of value, and number two, formulation of the general profit rate, identification of surplus value and profit, the misunderstanding of the relationship between value and cost price, close quote. For Ricardo, the unequal exchange between capital and labor was an exception to the law of value, but he did not deny the law, and he accepted the contradiction in this case. The law of the Ricardian school consists, to Marx's eyes, in considering the phenomenon of the law, of the phenomenon as the law of the phenomenon. One passes in this way from classical economics to vulgar economics, that is, something like a sort of academically syncretic and unprincipled eclectic compilations. Robert Torrance, in an essay on the production of wealth, 1821, is not aware of the contradiction, but takes it as a fact because of the development of humanity. The contradiction would have existed in an early stage period of society, but the presence of capital the contradiction would have existed as an early stage period of society. But the presence of capital surpasses the contradiction. For Marx, in fact, the vulgar analysis of the decadent economist covers up the contradiction. Quote, Torrance, according to whom the value of commodities was determined by the labor time embodied in them, in the early period when men confronted one another simply as owners and exchangers of goods, but not when capital and property in land have been evolved. This means that the law which applies to commodities qua commodities no longer applies to them once they are regarded as capital, close quote. The contradictory phenomenon was intuited by Ricardo as a problem because it upsets the law of value. For his followers, apparently critics, the contradictory phenomenon was transformed into the nature of things. In any case, Torrance has the merit of having launched the dispute regarding the content of the concept of cost of production. Marx relates it to cost price, commodity cost, natural price, market price, etc. One can see, as we've said before, that Marx does not yet assume a definitive position. James Mill, in his Elements of Political Economy, 1821, already goes far away from the reality that Ricardo relied upon. This is Mill, quote, the underlying contradictions themselves testify to the richness of the living foundation from which the theory itself developed. It is different with the disciple. His raw material is no longer reality, Wirklichkeit, but the new theoretical form in which the master had sublimated it. It's a new theoretical form in which the master have sublimated. It is, in part, the theoretical disagreement of opponents of the new theory, and in part, often paradoxical relationship of this theory to reality, which drive him to seek to refute his opponents and explain away reality. Mill wants to present bourgeois production as the absolute form of production, and seeks therefore to prove that its real contradictions are only apparent ones, close quote. In other words, Marx clarifies that all theory, when it is explicative, is an expression of reality. We're already back to Kant. Because of that, Ricardo, who still had reality as the reference of his theory as the living fundament, clearly discovered the contradiction as contradiction and considered it as an exception. His disciples instead considered the teacher's new theoretical form as the raw materials of their theory, fetishized it, eliminated from it the contradictions, and judged it as reality itself. The only apparent turns real, and if true, that the same historical interests, those of industrial capital against landed property, were the basis for the theorization of Ricardo and Mill. In the former, it was a correct expression of an authentic, serious thought, while in the latter, that is Mill, it was fetishized, idealized, and vulgarized. The superficial explanations of John Mill help Marx to understand, as we've explained in Chapter 1, the relationship between capital and living labor. See pages 277 to 88. Mill, like all the rest, did not discover the necessary connecting links, the Mittelglieder, the categories that would express the development of reality, but he subordinated directly the concrete in the abstract. Once again, Marx distinguishes clearly between labor, that is living labor, and labor capacity, and does not speak yet of potency or labor force. So we're at this kind of intermediate stage, right? In short, these are magnificent pages worth of Marx's position about the unequal exchange, as I just mentioned, between capital and labor is summarized. Marx concludes, quote, "This, in fact, is the contradiction in which bourgeois society develops, as has ever hitherto existing society. And this is declared to be a necessary law, i.e., the existing state of affairs, which is declared to be absolutely reasonable." Close quote. It seems that Marx's epistemological attention is growing. Every time there are more and more reflections about the method, about the status of the economist discourse, it seems that Marx is acquiring a greater explicit consciousness of the way of developing his own discourse. The critical confrontations have given him the sufficient epistemological security to continue his more systematic investigations later. Now, we should note from now on that for Marx, the opposite of the scientific, dialectic, correct is the fetishized, when what one considers as real or essential is merely the apparent. What emerges from capital's fetishist form, that is, the Fetischgestalt der Kapitals. The opposition is between science and fetishism, and not science and ideology, as for Althusser. So this is an important distinction, at least for Marx himself. And obviously, we can spend a lot more time fiddling around with this problem and why, Althusser makes that choice, etc. Marx treats two more questions regarding Mill. First of all, the non-understanding of the industrial cost price, that is the value of the advanced capital plus the average profit, page 290, the industrial cost price in relation to absolute rent, page 288. Second, so two questions regarding Mill. First, This is, not understanding the industrial cost price. And second, the claim to demonstrate the direct identity of supply and demand. Now, this question, let me break here for a second before quoting from Marx. This question, identity of supply and demand, obviously manifests itself in certain kinds of things, like, for example, in the neoclassical context, price. Anyway, back to the text. Marx writes, quote, one can conclude from his logic that he takes over the quite illogical Ricardian structure, which we analyzed earlier, and naively regards it on the whole as a quote unquote natural order, close quote. So we're on page 128. Marx studies 8 more authors. Now you can see why theory of surplus value, it has all this historical stuff that he wants to, situate. So in the first place, Guillaume Prévost, in his several observations on the systems of Ricardo of 1825, which Marx mentions as reflections, is based on John Mill and explicates Ricardo. Now, these lines are worth quoting for our purposes. Quote, loss and gain within a single country cancel each other out, but not so with trade between different countries. So this is actually important. 3 days of labor of one country can be exchanged against one of another country, a point not noted by J.B. Say. Here, the law of value undergoes essential modification. The relationship between working days of different countries may be similar to that existing between skilled, composed labor and unskilled, simple labor within a country. So in this case, the richer country exploits the poorer one, even where the latter gains by the exchange. So here is an interesting commentary on ostensibly comparative advantage using national borders as scale and national borders as a kind of difference. And of course, it's a comment also on trade. Anyway, unquote. From the polemic work, that is, observations on certain verbal disputes of 1821, be interesting to find out who actually wrote this thing because it's listed as anonymous. It is worthwhile underlining what we've already partly referred to in section 7.3 as the following problem: that neither living labor nor land has any value. The labor capacity has value, and regarding land, what is paid is the price which is paid for capitalized rent. That is the right of demanding a rent from the property of land. So you can see, this sort of legal apparatus is sort of built into this. There's a much larger conversation going on here. Anyway, back to the text. Regarding an inquiry into those principles of 1821, also Marx shows, on the one hand, an infinite patience to continue his critiques, but on the other hand, he understands that the critical confrontations are coming to their end because he's considering works that are turning from vulgar into apologetic ones. Now, the same could be said regarding the work of Thomas Quincy, most of all, the logic of political economy, 1845. Now, to Samuel Bailey, instead, regarding his work, A Critical Dissertation on the Nature, Measures, and Causes of Value of 1825, Marx dedicates nearly 25 pages of Notebook 14. Later, these reflections will appear in Book 1 of Capital. Bailey enables Marx to explore his point of view about value and to criticize the clear fetishist position of the know-it-all. We analyzed this subject at the beginning of this section. This text should be placed between the reflections expressed in Chapter 1 of the Contribution, that is, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859, and the first 3 paragraphs of Chapter 1 of Volume 1 of Capital. See, this is that front loading again, right? It is an intermediate text with progress in relation to the Contribution of 1859. Quote, hence the individual commodity as value, as the embodiment of the substance entity, that is the Dasein, is different from itself as use value, as an object an object thing, the ding, quite apart from the expression, the Ausdruck, of its value in other commodities. As the embodiment of labor time, it is value in general, Wert überhaupt, as the embodiment of a definite quantity of labor time. It is a definite magnitude of value. Close quote. Now, the references to Hegel's logic are explicit, technical, and continuous. Note that I made that already, pointed that out. The thing that is commodity, a more developed and concrete level of the concept of being, abstractly contains value, which is being as such, indeterminate quality, qualitatively the same and differ only quantitatively according to labor time. So this is a kind of a long way around to get to labor time, with determinate quantity as degree or magnitude, footnote 10. But even if the magnitude of value be determinate in itself as such, Marx is far from thinking that value could be an absolute. Quote, it's quite wrong to say that the value of a commodity is thereby transformed from something relative into something absolute. As value, it appears as something merely posited, something merely determined by its relation, the Verhältnis, to socially necessary equal simple labor time. It is to such an extent relative that when the labor time required for its reproduction changes, its value changes. So there's something in here about perhaps scale, other matters, close quote. Anyway, that value is posited, footnote 11, means the opposite of the being, the undifferentiated absolute. The being thing is a term of a relationship. And as always, in the Grundrisse and in the text capital, the question of the social condition as alienated, the Antassert, individual labor, is related to the question of the fetishism, the value that is a relative entity to the being of human beings, big B, being of human beings, is attributed to things, to the thing in itself, or as a relationship among things. Quote, Bailey is a fetishist in that he conceives value, although not as a property of the individual object considered in isolation, but as a relation of objects to one another, while it is only a representation in objects, an objective expression of a relation between human beings, a social relation, the relationship of human beings with their reciprocal productive activity, close quote. Kind of a little wordy there, I suppose. All right, back to the text. Marx analyzes many other subjects that will not include because they're hopefully easy to understand with a simple reading. Marx has an even more negative judgment about McCulloch than about Malthus, scientifically because he was an apologist for the existing state of affairs, but also because he supported the interests of landlords, and especially because of the contempt that he shows toward the working class. His only fear, driven to ridiculous extremes, is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, page 353. Now, against what many vulgar, cosmological, that is, positivist or dogmatist materialist thought, vulgar materialism thought, Marx stands for the defense of labor as human instead of the mere physical or animal activities. Like not unlike, I suppose, the Anthropocene. Anyway, quote, the miserable Mac has taken Ricardo to extremes. He who in his cogent efforts to utilize Ricardian theory eclectically, along with those opposed to it, identifies its principle and as socially determined human activity with the physical action, etc., which commodities possess as use values, as things. he who abandons the very concept of labor itself. Close quote. Facing this, now Marx had no option but to conclude, quote, this vulgarization of Ricardo represents the most complete and most frivolous decline of Ricardo's theory, close quote. Edward Gibbon Wakefield, in his work England and America of 1833, treats in part the question of the exchange between past labor and present labor, and he has the intuition that profit would be explicable if wages corresponded to the value of labor. It'd be, yeah. Patrick James Sterling, in his Philosophy of Trade of 1846, adds nothing new because he represents a vulgar return to primitive mercantilist theories. As we will later see, section 9.4, Marx gradually understands that only the classics are important, that is, scientific or serious. The rest is non-scientific decadence. Section 9.3, critical reactions, the MECW 32, pages 373 to 449. Leaving aside the socialist critics, Marx considers the critics that emerge from the sinews of the capitalist discourse himself. He deals with three works or authors. In the first place, the short work, The Source and Remedy of the National Difficulties, 1821, by an anonymous author. One cannot say that Marx learned something new. Not even the confrontation takes him to new problems. The work has become tedious. It's necessary now to finish the inventory. This work bluntly describes surplus value or profit, as Ricardo calls it, often also surplus produce or interest, as the author of the pamphlet terms it, as surplus labor, the labor which the worker performs gratis. In addition, Marx begins a transition that would take him about 232 pages of notebooks, 14 to 18. He slowly gets into the questions of accumulation, interest, mercantile capital, profit, etc. Later, he returns to the three authors being studied here, now under a more adequate title, that is, Proletarian Opposition, footnote 12, starting from Ricardo, which is really the position of the three authors or works that Marx is now considering in this section. Indeed, Marx is aware that these authors, under a more or less economic utopian, critical, and revolutionary form from the surplus product point of view, or from surplus labor, or the unproductiveness of capital, understand that labor still is everything. Die Arbeit ist alles. If for Hegel truth is everything, footnote 12, footnote 13, that is to say, the concept is absolute in itself only in the case of being totally developed as absolute knowledge. For Marx, the truth of capital and of political economy is labor. Returning to our anonymous author, we see that Marx has a clear understanding of his limitations because his epistemological attention grows. The pamphlet, the pamphlet is no theoretical treatise. It's a protest against the false reasons. It does not consequently make the claim that its conception of surplus value as surplus labor carries with it the general criticism of the entire system of economic categories. The author stands rather on Ricardian ground and is only consistent in stating one of the consequences inherent in the system itself, and he advances it in the interest of the working class against capital. The author remains a captive of the economic categories as he finds them, close quote. Come on. In a way, Marx describes here the work performed in the theories of theories of surplus value. That is a general criticism of the entire system of economic categories. Now, from where did Marx perform that criticism? Now, we will see that later. The question is absolutely central, actual, and essential for us. Latin Americans of the beginning of the 21st century in a non-revolutionary situation. See section 12.2. The anonymous author of 1821 is often correct in his critique of the capitalist and in his description of surplus value. The capitalist will extract from the laborers the produce of every hour's labor beyond what is possible for the laborer to subsist on. Page 374. On the functions of foreign commerce, that absorbs the revenue of capitalists in foreign luxury goods, and that impedes the reconversion of surplus product into capital. Page 377. With that, Marx begins to consider the question of, yes, accumulation, footnote 14, and spare time for free activities, etc. Now, the issue is now that the surplus product accumulates as capital. The revenue, that is profit, realized surplus product, can follow a double path. Quote, number one, reproduction on the existing scale. Number two, reproduction on an expanded scale, or accumulation, transformation of revenue into capital. Close quote. Now we return to subjects previously discussed, footnote 15. Regarding reproduction, Marx insists that the realized value not only returns as variable capital, but also as constant capital. One part reproduces wages, while the other part maintains the value of constant capital. In this way, it is equally correct that the labor added during the year, using year as obviously a measure, is not represented entirely by that part of the period. It's not represented entirely by that part of the product, which can be resolved into wages and profit. 385. Regarding accumulation or reproduction at an expanded scale, Marx analyzes its diverse possibilities, either as accumulation of variable capital or of constant capital. In any case, this new capital consists solely of the appropriated labor of other people. Piercy Ravenstone, author of Thoughts on the Funding System and Its Effects, 1824, adequately states the objective category of relative surplus labor. Adequately states the objective category of relative surplus labor, a theoretical accomplishment reached, as in the previous case, because they defend the interest of the proletariat. Interest, as a fundamental or radical project, opens the possibility of the theory, footnote 16, for all of them. In a strict Ricardian sense, labor is the only creative source of value, of surplus value. In third place, see, finally, in third place, Thomas Hodgkin, in his work Labor Defended Against the Claims of Capital, 1825, and in Popular Political Economy of 1827, enables Marx to settle again some epistemological questions. The economists, he says, quote, simply express in theoretical terms the notions of the practical human beings who are engrossed in capitalist production, dominated by it and interested in it, close quote. Quote, if in capitalist production, hence in political economy, its theoretical expression, that is past labor, were met with only as a pedestal, etc., created for labor by labor itself, then such a controversial issue would not have arisen. It only exists because in the real life of capitalist production, as well as in its theory, materialized labor appears as a contradiction to itself. To material labor appears as a contradiction to itself, that is, to living labor, close quote. Now, from the bourgeois perspective, as expressed before, from the real interest of the capitalist class, captivated and dominated by its effective conditioning, theory can only express certain representations or constitute determinative categories and not others. For that, Hodgkin himself starts out from a standpoint which is economically narrow-minded, as he conceives capital as an external production relation and reduces it to the accumulation of the skill and knowledge of the worker. certainly one perspective. It is a lofty idealism against the rough material fetishism or a crude materialism directed exclusively toward the satisfaction of coarse appetites of a McCulloch, pages 399 to 400. And all the discussion about the subject of accumulation, Marx distinguishes three levels. Quote, this historical act is the historical genesis of capital, accumulation of capital on the basis of capital itself, and therefore also on the basis of the relationship of capital and wage labor. Concentration of capital, accumulation of large amounts of capital by the destruction of the smaller capitals, attraction. Decapitalization of the immediate links, the intermediate links, decapitalization of the intermediate links between capital and labor as functionaries of the process, which at the same time accelerates this social production, and thereby also the development of the productive forces, the capitalists become superfluous in the measure that they, on behalf of society, enjoy this usufruct, and that they become overbearing as owners of this social wealth and commanders of social labor. Closed quote. Hence, the end of capitalism, the time of globalization, would be its own destruction, decadence, and the passage to a superior moment of history. So let us recall some of the multiple topics that Marx discusses in these pages, that is 403 to 449. First of all, primitive accumulation is not a mere possession of money, that is not a hoard. Thus, primitive accumulation, as, quote, thus primitive accumulation, as I've already shown, footnote 17, means nothing but the separation of labor and the worker from the conditions of labor which confront him as independent forces. Once capital exists, the capitalist mode of production itself evolves in such a way that it maintains and reproduces this separation on a constantly increasing scale until the historical reversal takes place, close quote. In the second place, accumulation, footnote 18, by the means of reproduction, as we've seen, is transformed into a permanent movement. Quote, accumulation by means of the reconversion, the Rückverwandlung of profit or surplus produce into capital now becomes a continuous process, close quote. Hence, capital becomes totally as force which is alienated, the from debt, from labor that returns to itself in perpetual circulation, and hence the rhythm of reproduction accelerates. The accumulated capital, on the other hand, is either fixed capital, buildings, machinery, etc., or raw materials or instrumental materials, or a stock of commodities, but mainly the worker's skill, the degrees of development of labor. Marx studies the way in which interest can be accumulated. And lastly, there are reflections upon three independent phenomena. That is the rate of exploitation, the rate of profit, and the accumulation of capital, because some of these can increase or decrease, but not the rest. We're on page 134. This is section 9, subsection 9.4, the fetishism of revenue, a sort of conclusion of the theories of surplus value. This is the last section I think we get to end at the end of this section. Through these notebooks of the second part of our work, Marx has been acquiring progressive consciousness in the critical confrontations with the diverse representatives of capitalist political economy, of the epistemological handling of these authors. Neither of them can even conceive of the entire system of economic categories of capitalism, as we have seen in the previous section. I think it's the previous section. Indeed, this is what Marx claims to do with these theories of surplus value. It is neither a history nor a surplus value theory. It is a creative or generating confrontation of categories that is a general criticism of the capitalist economy. Quote, classical economy is not interested in elaborating how the various forms come into being, footnote 19, but seeks to reduce them to their unity by means of analysis because it starts from them as given premises. And in brackets, read the fully copied text at the beginning of this chapter, close quote. So at the beginning of the Grundrisse, Marx had as his task to dialectically construct a certain order in the development of categories. Footnote 20. Now, only now, at the end of the theoretical experience of these numerous critical confrontations, Marx has a clear understanding of his initial project, the genetic development of categories, the genetic exposition or representation of the content of the concepts of a science as a new system. Marx carefully uses the notion of science, footnote 21, but is self-conscious of his handling. So altogether, his criticism of Proudhon is that of a novice. He has not mastered the first elements of the science he intends to criticize, close quote. We will not elaborate here because it gets done in chapter 12, but we do wish to recall once again that for Marx, the opposite of science is fetishism and not simply ideology as it is for Althusser, and therefore that these pages might be considered as a conclusion of the theories of surplus value because Marx gradually understood the increasing degree of fetishization in which the discourse of economic science was falling into. For Marx, the decadence advanced in three levels of mystification. That is, mystification A, from classical to vulgar economics, B, from the latter, that is, from vulgar economics to the apologetic, and C, mystification C, from the latter to the professorial form. Quote, now, since such works only appear when political economy has reached the end of its scope as a science, they are at the same time the graveyard of this science. Close quote. Let me break here for a second. And in fact, is that not what happens when we reach to points of incommensurability, in any particular discipline? Anyway, enough of that. Back to the text. Interest-bearing capital, a question that Marx had already started with Hodgkin, and that is the subject matter of these pages, that is revenue and its sources, is the ideal theoretical location for non-science, that is non-science. Quote, now the complete reification, inversion, and derangement of capital as interest-bearing capital is capital which yields compound interest. It appears as a Moloch demanding the whole world as a sacrifice belonging to it of right, whose legitimate demands arising from its very nature are, however, never met and always frustrated by a mysterious fate, close quote. Its mysterious fetishization is manifested in the fact that it appears to be the source of value. Quote, in the form of interest-bearing capital, it becomes quite obvious that capital without expending any labor appropriates the fruits of the other people's labor, for it appears here in a form in which it is separated from the production process as such. But it can do this only because, in this form, it indeed enters by itself, without labor, into the labor process as an element which in itself creates value, or the product without labor. It has also created it without labor ex proprio sinu, that is, out of itself, close quote. So once the capital is fetishized, then the vulgar economists, on the other hand, feel completely at home, precisely with the alienated form in which the different parts of value confront one another. Just as a scholar is familiar with God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, so are the vulgar economists with land rent, capital interest, and labor wages. That's it. Anyway, page 502, that's an interesting trinity, as I say. Anyway, back to the text. The process of fetishization, or non-science, is a progressive separation from living labor. It's not possible to understand the relationship between the categorical system and living labor. Marx, on the contrary, conceives economic science as the genetic development of the concept of living labor. Let me repeat that. Marx, on the contrary, conceives economic science as the genetic development of the concept of living labor. From there, he not only makes the general criticism of all the categories already constituted, but also constitutes his own categories, explaining some of them, starting with other categories, without jumps and without violating the law of value. It is about the development of the concept of capital from the criticism effectuated from the exteriority or from the non-capital, that is, from living labor. Now we return to this point later. Footnote 22. The epistemological levels of progressive non-science fetishism are the following. Quote, classical political economy seeks to reduce the various fixed and mutually alien forms of wealth to their inner unity by means of analysis, and to strip away the form in which they exist independently along one another. It therefore reduces rent to surplus profit so that increases to be a specific separate form and is divorced from its apparent source, that is, the land. Close quote. Marx had respect for classical economics because, although it identifies profit and surplus value or confuses a historical form, that is capitalism, as if it were a natural form, it has consciousness of its contradictions, or at least it states them, while vulgar economics falls into a first level of fetishization. Quote, only when political economy has reached a certain stage of development and has assumed well-established forms, that is, after Adam Smith does the separation of the element whose notion of the phenomena consists of a mere reflection of them take place, i.e., its vulgar element becomes a special aspect of political economy. Thus, J.B. Say separates the vulgar notions occurring in Adam Smith's work and puts them forward in a distinct, crystallized form. Close quote. We can say that happens in textbooks, for example. Back to the text. Capitalistic economics advances a step further when it is transformed into an explicit defender of the capitalist system in power. Quote, vulgar political economy deliberately becomes increasingly apologetic and makes strenuous attempts to talk out of existence the ideas which contain the contradictions. Close quote. Yeah, back to textbooks again. But there is yet but one more superficial level of the science. The last form is the academic. Quote, the last form is the academic form which proceeds historically and with wise moderation collects the best from all sources. And in doing this, contradictions do not matter. On the contrary, what matters is comprehensiveness. That they look down in an equally superior manner on the fantasies of the socialist need hardly be expressed. Close quote. Yeah, textbooks. For these scientists, the real reality has become a fictitious reality. The fetishized form takes the place of the real. Quote, it's a kind of fiction without fantasy, a religion of the vulgar. In fact, the vulgar economist, by no means to be confused with the economic investigator we have been criticizing, translate the concepts, motives, etc., of the representatives of capitalist production who are held in thrall to this system of production and whose consciousness only its superficial appearance is reflected. They translate them into a doctrinaire language, but they do so from the standpoint of the ruling section, i.e., the capitalists. And their treatment is therefore not naive and objective, but apologetic. Close quote. See Steve Keen on economic textbooks, needless to say. All right, back to the text. Interest-bearing capital, interest, commercial profit, and rent are secondary forms of industrial capital or of industrial profit. But in the end, They are forms on the surface in which the hidden manifests what is behind surplus value and unpaid labor. Quote, thus the participants in capitalist production live in a bewitched world, and their own relationships appear to them as properties of things, as properties of the material elements of production, close quote. Everything has turned irrational. Footnote 23, and we're at the end. So this is the little paragraph that starts part 3, which we will get to tomorrow in the next chapter, chapter 10. New discoveries. In the third part, we shall examine notebooks 15 to 18, written from November 1862 to July 1863. Most of these texts have not been translated yet into any Romance language. Footnote 1. These notebooks have 2 parts, clearly differentiable, which I shall divide into chapters 10 and 12. 10 and 11, sorry. Chapter 10 deals with themes related to volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, the book, here still called chapter 2 and 3, as we shall see, up through page 1157 of the manuscript, which is up to page 371 of volume 33 of the MECW. Chapter 11 deals with the rest of the manuscript, where Marx returns to the continuation of his draft of volume 1 of Capital, which he had abandoned in notebook 5 about relative surplus value of machinery, from page 372 of volume 33 of the MECW to page 336 of volume 34. We are then at the end, yes, finally, at the end of manuscripts of 1861 to 63, where, thanks to the analysis of the production cost in a definitive manner, Marx clarifies the concept of price of production, which now only he distinguishes from cost price as an autonomous category. So we're at the end. Thank you for indulging this little listening project. We've been looking at chapter 9 of the Dussel book, and I will thank you for your attention, as well as ending the live stream. So ending